Today's topic is conventional gardens, and it is really an unconventional approach to conventional gardens. We want to see how we turn them into watershed-wise landscapes. And there we go. So the big question that we asked ourselves when we started talking about conventional gardens is, why do we always assume that a watershed-wise landscape has to look like this, or this, or this, or this? Where did this idealized California chaparral landscape turn into the accepted aesthetic for our SoCal landscapes? It's obviously um, it's obviously something that has a lot of attraction to it. It's biodiversity and a sense of place, and having that notion that we want to bring people into gardens and help them have a sense of place of being in Southern California, being in tune with our resources. Um, that is a that's a great notion, and that is something that many of us as professionals, as designers, as planners, and as installers of landscapes, we can get our heads around that. But you know, driving to this aesthetic over the last, in my case anyway, 2.5 decades of doing this work, I find that maybe we're actually leaving people behind who don't share this aesthetic as something that they want to have in their landscapes or in their on their properties. And it's sometimes not even a matter of education. They hike, they understand what's out there, they just don't want it in their homes. So, how do we set objectives through all the programs that we do, and WELO, turf removal programs, uh, California Conservation Way of Life, all the frameworks that we use to pursue valuing the water use in landscapes are driving us to having landscapes that are like this. And um, we think that because we're focused on that, the result is that our programs are all about remove and replace. And I can speak for myself as a professional. I spent 20 years going into landscapes, even for consultations, and essentially looking for what can be removed so that I could help the property owners achieve that idealized chaparral environment. Um, Removal, not just of lawn, but of really everything on the property. And in, I will admit that in a lot of my designs, the results of the analysis, the site analysis and so forth was, take out, take out, take out. But when we are removing all of that organic matter from sites, and again, we're not just talking about lawns. This is shrubs and trees and just, creating a blank slate so that we can impose onto the landscape, a new thing. As noble as that pursuit might be, we are generating a lot of organic green waste as a result of that approach when we do the installation. Um, and where does all that green waste go? A lot of it used to go to landfills. Unfortunately, in California, we have adopted regulation, that legislation actually, that is now redirecting organic matter out of landfills and into processing facilities and a stream of organic material processing that will ultimately return it to urban areas and also to farms through composting and so forth. But this is a very intensive process. It's a lot of material. It creates methane emissions. Um, and it requires not just hauling and trucking, but also two-stroke engines to remove grass, to remove plants from a landscape. So, and in addition to that, just sort of, uh, I call it the tabula rasa, right? The empty slate or blank slate. In addition to that aesthetic or that approach to designing and installing, to really kind of make it easy on us, to be honest, it's a lot easier to work from a blank slate than it is to work around things. We end up directing clients into landscapes that we often find there's pushback on the actual implementation, the replacements. There are inclusivity issues, and a lot of it comes from affordability. And that is not just in the design and installation, but also in the management of the site, the accessibility of professionals that know how to manage a site that is a completely different palette from what we had before. Uh, and a lot of these issues are kind of percolating in property owners and managers' minds as we are proposing these changes. And really, the question is, can we flip the script on this? Can we find ways to actually value conventional and existing landscapes and either migrate people to something different on a slower time frame, or working with that existing landscape, shift to adding more to the landscape, making it functional not by elimination, but rather by addition. And in doing so, perhaps we can actually meet goals that we set, big goals for water conservation and stormwater management, biodiversity. Maybe there are different paths for getting to those goals. And also, maybe we actually end up having more participants, sure, at a essentially lower level of engagement. They may not be going full bore California chaparral landscape, but they are adding things that are getting them further along the pathway. And in aggregate, it helps us to reach our big goals. Sort of the 20/80 rule. Can we get 80% of the people to do 20% of the change? And is that better than having 20% of the people doing 80% of the change? So it's something to think about. And essentially what we're doing is we're creating more on-ramps for all landscapes. It's an inclusive ideal where we can get these objectives met faster, we have more engagement, and considering how long it takes for us to implement these very big programs in California, I mean, I was reminded just last week that MWILO has been around since the early 90s. Considering we have this much time, maybe a strategy for bringing along these landscapes would be something that we should explore. And that's really what today's workshop is all about. Exploring how the conventional landscape can be turned into a watershed-wise landscape. And in being so, it's sort of an unconventional water-wise landscape because it looks different. So today's workshop is going to be divided into 7 puzzle pieces. First, we're going to talk a little bit about design. Where does all this conventional or traditional landscaping come from? We're going to talk as we always do, about the soil sponge, how it fits into this paradigm, how we create it without removing everything. We're going to talk about capturing rain. What are some of the plants that are maybe have been ignored or passed over in the last few decades that actually work within a conventional system that uh, can help us to achieve our objectives? What if we want to keep some of the lawn? What are some of the considerations there? And the nightmare of irrigation, especially if we are going to be keeping portions of the existing landscape. How do we achieve our irrigation objectives? And then finally, how do we move things along into a more ecosystem thinking, a more integrated system thinking, so that the change is moving us again toward our objectives? So let's start with the origins of this conventional gardens or traditional gardens idea. Of course, a lot of the design that we are talking about is based on a long history and traditions of landscaping throughout the world. There are Italian gardens and the high Renaissance gardens, French landscapes, um, even English gardens, which often cottage gardens comes to mind when you think of English gardens, but on a grand scale, there's always control. The thing about conventional landscapes is control is a very important part of it. Within each of these rooms, things may be going on that have a more untamed or chaotic nature to them, but it's always in a room that is happening. It can't be let out into the rest of the landscape. Asian gardens also have a very tight control. The palette is controlled. The way that the plants are managed is highly controlled. Tropical gardens have traditionally have a very similar aesthetic to them, even though the look of them is very green and lush. They continue to have that clipping, the management of or installation of the color palette, and it is all a very controlled experience. The designers, the installers of these landscapes, the property owners that funded the landscapes wanted you to know that they had a handle on things. And so the view is controlled, the way that you experience the garden is very controlled. You're given pathways, you're given directions on where to go. And even when these aesthetics were translated into the estate gardens of California, they didn't miss a beat with continuing this element of control and of, even this use of uh, lawn areas as a visual resting place, which is often what lawn is considered. It's a nice green rest, eye rest. It still is in a context of it's bounded, it's kept short, it is, it's man, or in the sense human, has put it in its place. But why can't we consider these gardens climate appropriate? What is it about the gardens that makes it not climate appropriate? I mean, with all the boxwood and plum trees, hydrangeas, even tropical gardens that we see here in Southern California, uh, could these be watershed wise? And we believe the answer is yes, they absolutely can be watershed wise. It's a shift in the way we think about them. Unfortunately, although they have the potential to be watershed wise, the reality is that these gardens, like pretty much all the gardens um, that we encounter, unfortunately, they often look like this. They are bare. They look untended. The soils are compacted. There's no mulch anywhere to be seen. The pruning is abysmal. Uh, there's little or no thought to hydrozoning. Irrigation is there, but it hasn't really been laid out in the most efficient manner, hasn't been designed in the most efficient manner. Trees are struggling in bare soil. Here we have artificial turf blanketing a ficus. I mean, what could be, yeah, I don't even have really have words for that. And what's up with that irrigation? This is the implementation of conventional landscapes. This is, it maybe wasn't designed this way, or maybe it was, but the management of it certainly has taken us to this place. And so the conventional landscapes end up being even more degraded than we could imagine. I mean, we've encountered things like this. I mean, where do we even begin? I mean, is it a landscape when it looks like this? This is in a prominent spot, and yet it's not functional in any way, shape, or form. So the premise that we want to apply to this workshop is, what if we took these conventional landscapes and we used the principles of the watershed approach on those conventional landscapes without the idea of total eradication of the existing landscape? We would still be focusing on healthy living soil because that's always the most important thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important, beyond water savings and beyond um, the benefits that we get for stormwater management, but really that we cannot have a healthy landscape of any kind without focusing on healthy living soil. We want to make sure that we are selecting climate appropriate plants because we need to have plants that are adapted to the conditions of Southern California so they don't continually require input. And that has in the past led us to elimination of many plants that have the characteristics of being drought tolerant or being able to thrive in Southern California without a lot of input. But eliminating them because they are not local California natives. We, of course, love local California natives and we want to promote them. But by only focusing on them, we do eliminate a lot of other potential plant material that could fit into a conventional paradigm. Passively capturing rainwater and using it as a resource becomes fairly complicated in an existing garden, because our current understanding of how to do that requires us to either have a device that we store water in or make some kind of topography changes within the landscape so that we can hold on to water. And if the landscape is an existing one, we're going to encounter a lot of issues that have to be overcome to implement that. And then finally, the highly efficient supplemental irrigation, only when necessary, becomes very, very challenging in an existing landscape, mostly because an efficient irrigation system is one that is designed efficiently. The equipment is manufactured correctly. The implementation has been done properly, and it's being managed properly. We find in those existing landscapes and conventional landscapes that often, all of those things which do lead to efficiency are either non-existent, or if they were ever, now the landscape has evolved beyond where the irrigation system can be efficient. So irrigation becomes very, very challenging in an existing landscape, and we're going to talk a lot about that. As I said before, perhaps it's a change in perspective that we need. Maybe what we need to start to think about is shifting our design, installation, and management paradigm from what do we need to kill? What do we need to control? How do we, uh, how do we eliminate things from problems from or things that we perceive as problems from our landscape and shift our thinking to what can we encourage in this landscape? What can we stimulate? How do we add something into this to make it more complex or to make it more resilient? And this is a very deep paradigm shift. Um, it's something that really applies to every single landscape, not just the ones we're talking about today, the conventional or existing landscapes. And I think personally, and I know our organization feels very strongly that this is the essential mind shift for landscapes of the 22nd century. Growing the soil sponge, absolutely critical. Every landscape needs to focus on this. There are no landscapes where this is a done deal. Most importantly, we need to stop fertilizing. Fertilizing, applying any kind of water-soluble nutrient is really damaging our landscapes. We need to feed biology in the soil so that the biology can convert minerals into plant available food. This is totally different from water soluble nutrient. Water soluble nutrient, as the name implies, requires water. So if we're putting fertilizers into the landscape, and I'm talking about even organic stimulants or that aren't just biostimulants, but organic fertilizers, what we're essentially doing is we're saying to the plant, you need to find the water in order to process this nutrient. Alternatively, when we are relying on the soil and the biology in the soil to mine the nutrients and mine the minerals rather, and create the food for the plant when the plant needs it, we are eliminating the need for additional water in the landscape. We need water in landscapes, there's no question, because the soil microbiome is a subaquatic, ecosystem. It is a water ecosystem. Things swim in soil. But what we're saying is we don't need additional water so that the plant can uptake that nutrient. If we are really concerned about water conservation, we will stop fertilizing landscapes. And instead, we will feed the biology with compost, with worm castings, and with mulch. These are the critical components. And this is called, in general, a decomposition pathway to building carbon in the soil. We're allowing microorganisms to decompose this organic matter to create carbon in the soil and to change the soil structure. Soil health is the essential part of landscape health. And this chart is included to help us to wrap our heads around this shift from adding nutrient to a landscape, shifting from that to adding organic matter, both in the form of matter to be decomposed and also in the form of additional plants that will put carbon in the soil. That shift is focused on helping the plants be their very best selves. And one way that we can measure whether a plant is maximizing or I hate to use the word efficient when I talk about plants, quite honestly, because plants are efficient. In and of themselves, but perhaps the efficient utilization of minerals and of food. One way to measure that is by looking at what are called the bricks, which is essentially like a sap, almost a sap analysis of the plants themselves. Bricks is a measurement of the water soluble um, minerals in the leaves of the plant or in the organic material of the plant. And so I used to understand bricks because I saw it used in agriculture for analyzing the sugar content of various foods, especially in the wine industry. So that's where I first heard about bricks. And I always thought, well, okay, this is a measure of the sugar that is in the grape. And while that is something that is done and is a valid use of bricks, I now understand that bricks is really something more than sugar. It is all of the minerals that have been processed by the plant and how they appear within the structure of the plant. And so by measuring bricks, we can begin to get an understanding of where the plant is in its efficiency of getting minerals from the soil microbiome and getting them up into the structure of the plant. As you can see from this chart, and there's quite a lot of scientific literature here that is working on translating a lot of this analysis. But as you can see from this chart, when a plant has very low bricks content in its plant matter, this is a condition that is essentially attracting insects of various kinds. So you can see here that aphids, as an example, and sucking insects, but aphids in particular, are attracted to plants that have a Brix index that is pretty low. A 6 to 8 is where aphids will actually, I mean, this is a whole other thing, but aphids can actually sense the wavelength of light and other electromagnetic wavelengths that are emitted from the plant, from the mineral within the plant, and are attracted to the plant. Anyway, when it's a low Brix. As Brix increases, however, there begins to become a resistance to insects. So particular insects will go away or not be attracted to the plant once this Brix begins to exceed the low numbers. And there are some insects that are actually, pretty high up in the Brix, at 12, 10 to 12 plus. Grasshoppers can still be attracted to that. But when you start to get to a very high Brix of 15 and above, now we're seeing there's no insect pressure or very little insect pressure, and there's no disease pressure. What the heck is going on? This is essentially saying the healthier the soil is, the more diverse the microbiome is, so that all the different minerals that are mined by the microbiome, they are now residual within the plant itself. And when those minerals become part of the plant, the pressure from problems like insects and disease goes away. In other words, landscape health is absolutely determined by soil health. Adding compost to fruit trees is an essential thing. And in an existing landscape, it's really easy to do. Putting it around the roses, adding it into all the blooming plants that we're trying to grow, and putting mulch everywhere. And what kind of mulch? Well, green-brown mulches, something smaller than 1.5 inches. So this is mulch that we're putting down with the intention of it decomposing and turning into soil. The mulch should be 3 to 4 inches thick so that it actually does decompose and you don't have to be constantly adding onto it. There are certain considerations for fire zones, which I hope that we will be able to talk about, where we may want to have a uh, more shallow application of mulch so that it is decomposing faster. The challenge with that is we have to add more when it starts to decompose because we don't want to ever have bare soil. Bare soil heats up and the microbiome decreases, becomes, uh, you know, either dies or goes away or becomes inactive when the soil heats up. So keeping this mulch on top is really important. If we don't want to have to be adding mulch all the time, we want to keep it 3 to 4 inches thick. If we are committed to replacing it even as quickly as every couple months or adding to it every couple months, then we can keep a more shallow thickness. If we have compaction, making holes in the landscape using something as simple as a hand drill with an auger on it with an 18-inch long 5/8 inch diameter drill bit and poking holes in the soil where we have major compaction. We're only going down 18 inches and it's only 5/8 of an inch, so it's not major disturbance, but making those disturbances to create pathways, basically biomimicking worms, um, that is something that's legitimate for dealing with compaction in an existing landscape, and following immediately with worm castings or compost down those augered holes, watering it in. Now, decomposition pathway focuses on building the soil microbiome through the application of organic matter in the form of compost, worm castings, and mulch. But there's another way that we can build living soil. And in many ways, this is even faster and more pervasive than the decomposition pathway. And this is called the liquid carbon pathway. The liquid carbon pathway is the understanding that when we have living roots in the ground at all times, those plants are pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere, converting it into just the right strands of compounds and pumping it into the soil to the depth of their roots. So having as many plants in the ground as possible actually is creating a soil sponge a lot faster than when we have only a few plants. And this is something that conventional landscapes ignore. And actually, even some of our newer, replacement landscapes ignore this fact. So kind of getting rid of the conventional wisdom that says we always space plants for maturity. And this picture is the perfect example of how we used to talk about spacing plants in the landscape, understanding that your height is also your arm width, and that if a plant on the container says it's going to be a 5-foot diameter plant, then believe it and use your arms, at 5 feet to measure the distance between these plants so that they're properly spaced for maturity. That's conventional wisdom, whether we have a landscape that's existing or one that we're currently building. But it is actually contrary to the reality that we will get the benefits of healthy soil faster if we plant more plants. When we have a massive amount of biodiversity, a massive amount of plant material that is putting the exudates, putting that carbon into the soil, we are really stimulating the microbial community to utilize its biochemistry essentially to restructure the soil. So we are essentially putting the microbes in the soil to work for us. We're saying, okay, you guys, you need to build houses, you need to build highways, you need to build all the infrastructure that is necessary, the dams and the lakes and the rivers. We need to have all that infrastructure in the soil, and the soil microbes are going to build it. The way that we get to having a big diversity of plant roots is by maximizing the leaf structures of the plants that we're putting in. There's an added benefit, if you will, of not just planting one kind of leaf structure plant. And this is something that we find in conventional landscapes, and we find even in our replacement types of landscapes, where we become enamored with a particular broadleaf plant or a particular um, uh, evergreen type of leaf structure, and we're not mixing it up. We don't have grasses, next to something broadleaf, next to tiny leaves and so forth. And why am I even talking about that? Well, I'm talking about it because when we maximize the different types of leaf structures, we get different root structures. And different root structures are now re-engineering soil in different ways. And it's that diversity of root structure that is creating a massive reservoir within our landscape to hold on to water for the benefit of the plant. And also, it's a massive mining operation that's going on, because think about it, at every point of a growing root, there is a microbiome that is devoted to both keeping that plant hydrated and also mining the minerals out of the soil and rock to feed that plant what it needs when it wants it. When we have a landscape that is dedicated to plant material that only has a 3 or even 6 inch root structure, like our turf grass landscapes, we're missing this opportunity to build water reservoirs. And even in a conventional landscape, if we start, or an existing landscape, if we start to think about how can we add plants into this that will help us to create this root diversity, this is a excellent step toward changing the soil health and resultingly changing the overall health of the landscape. Don't forget that those root zones are also extended miles, become even more complex by their associations with fungi. The fungi will be able to access parts of the soil and reservoirs of water that the root hairs, the root structures themselves cannot access. And this is the critical component, this movement toward a more perennial landscape, toward a more woody landscape, toward a landscape that is pairing with fungi to help it make it through the times of drought and also the times of deluge. So having that incredible root diversity and um, having and moving more toward a perennial landscape is actually helping us to pair with fungi. And perhaps we need to recognize that an existing landscape that is filled with woody plants and trees and other perennial plants, this landscape could actually be favored by fungi over a new landscape where we remove all that and try to get plants established. Don't forget succession. Succession is what is determining the plant cover in our gardens. When we disturb the soil even if our intentions are great and our intention is to create a chaparral-like environment, we've disturbed the soil. And so we have taken ourselves back in a time machine. The soil has to rebuild itself. The soil has to go from being much more bacterially dominant into something that is more fungally dominant in order to support those perennial grasses, the shrubs, and the trees that we are looking at putting into our landscapes. If we already have those plants in the landscape, they may be struggling to partner with fungi, but perhaps there are things that we can add in to get them boosted and get them over the hurdle, get the fungi really growing there a lot faster, get the results of that healthy landscape than, for starting over again. So this is really something important for us to be considering. How do we capture rain? Well, the rules are we slow spread, sink, and store rain. It sounds really easy. And of course, it kind of is, because the simplest, best management practice is to have living mulch, to have, tree um, debris, whether we've brought it in the beginning, waiting for the plants to create their own, or we are harvesting the leaf litter from our site and keeping it on site. Either way, this is the simplest, best management practice for holding on to water and slowing stormwater. We want to keep our designs and installations of these stormwater elements very, very simple, keep them very shallow. 6 inches, 12 inches is an absolute digging nightmare. Keep it simple. 6 inches deep is perfectly fine. We can use very shallow trenches, divots in the landscape, um, and even on hillsides. We can do this very, very easily. And again, simply by keeping it shallow and by planting densely in these areas where we're capturing the water. Moving water around the landscape is essential for getting it all in the garden. So we have to spread it out. That means maybe we don't concentrate on a single basin somewhere. That's easy to do if we've removed everything and we're building anew. Sure, having a concentrated place or trying to get water into a very easy catchment area works perfectly. But when we have an existing landscape that has trees and shrubs and other plant material that we don't want to disturb, we're going to have to get creative about moving it around so that it gets in the landscape and doesn't just run off. Um, it's a challenge to put a rain garden into an existing landscape. Of course, we can slow down the water coming off the roof, and this is something that's often overlooked as part of the formula for capturing rain in a garden. Changing out downspouts, even in large industrial or commercial sites, changing them out for something that slows the water down, like a rain chain, um, is critical part of being able to capture the water. If the water's coming too quickly off of the buildings, or if it's directly piped out into the street, we cannot capture it all. So we need to slow it down and keep it freaking simple. In these overground diverters, they're not things of beauty. It's okay. Uh, They're easy, they're inexpensive, and they can help us to direct water to places within the landscape where we could hold on to it. We have so many um, people, because their ideal of how a landscape needs to look is geared toward perfection and geared toward things being hidden. Um, I like to hide valves, but rainwater catchment devices, they should be celebrated. And even something as simple as this can work. in an existing landscape. Rain barrels, they had their heyday 20 years ago. Everybody needed to put in a rain barrel. There were massive programs for getting rain barrels into landscapes, but they were promoted as storage devices. A rain barrel isn't a storage device. It's only holding 50 gallons, and that roof is generating 600 gallons per inch of water on a 1,000 square foot roof. It's not a storage device, but a rain barrel is a slowing device. It's a way to take the water coming down this, at incredible velocity down this downspout, slowing it down so it can then be directed into the landscape to a place where it makes sense. They are very low cost. They are very simple to install. They allow us to redirect water within the landscape without making it really complicated. We don't have to cut concrete. We don't have to install piping. We don't have to have a pump to get the water out of it. Rain barrels are not storage devices. They're slowing devices. And in that capacity, they are excellent parts of a rainwater catchment plan, and especially for an existing landscape where we can't do all the digging or we can't do all the cutting and so forth. Think about it. This is not simple. Not saying it's not legitimate. Of course it's legitimate. It's a great thing. And in the right place with enough space, etc., it's a terrific rainwater storage device. And this is storage now. We have enough capacity here. It requires such a level of expertise, though, to design it and to install it properly. There's permitting. There is figuring out where within the landscape we can put something of this size, if it's above ground or below ground. Either way, we still have that consideration when we are trying to hold on to volume of water. It requires pumping or piping in order to get the water into and out of this particular device, and it requires a maintenance plan. So this is a whole new system that is in your landscape. Is it legitimate for a conventional landscape if you've got the property and the place to do it and the means to do it? Absolutely. And if you don't have those things, you could pass it over for the passive capture with the rain barrel. What do we do about landscapes that have existing trees? They pose a lot of opportunity, of course, but also challenges to our objectives. Well, working around trees is something that we can begin to think about. How do we continue this shallow grading, the shallow catchment of rainwater in the landscape? Instead of digging around trees, we can build up around trees. You can see here that there is a basin essentially created here. It was not created by digging things out. It was created by placing this rock and riprap at the drip line of the tree and allowing the space inside of that's closer to the trunk to become the basin or the spreading ground of the water. The discharge that you see circled here is putting the water, into the whole landscape, and it's directing it into this basin that we've created by building up above ground. It's a very, very simple approach. Is it holding every single gallon of water? No. Is it getting water to the tree? Absolutely. Is it keeping water in the landscape? Absolutely. It's something to think about. We don't have to dig every time we think about capturing water in landscapes. And why not work with existing topography instead of trying, if we tried to create landscapes that are contoured, that are currently flat, and we want to contour them, that's one challenge. And then we also have landscapes that are very contoured, have hillsides and so forth that we want to capture water on, and our um, inclination may be to try to flatten them in order to do that. But maybe we could work with existing topography, follow the grade. Why get stressed? Like, let's figure out ways to add material onto the site, especially trees. Trees are going to be an excellent way for us to start to reduce the flow on a grade. And then, of course, plant material. This is a legitimate landscape rainwater catchment area, and it's done not by bulldozing and so forth, but by adding in more complexity. Working with the slope. This is a great example of what is a kind of gentle slope, but finding that we can actually create a very shallow depression that will fill with water at the top of the slope, that is densely planted. It doesn't jeopardize the slope. It's spreading the water out over it. Urban acupuncture. Starting to think about, well, if we have a hardscaped area within our landscape, perhaps we can go back and find ways to puncture it in various, take various approaches. Maybe instead of having a completely solid flagstone area, we start to cut or break up that flagstone and relay it in ways that allow us to have gaps, allow us to have more permeability. I think this term urban acupuncture is a great way for us to think about, especially in an existing landscape, how we're going to get more water into it. It's not necessarily a massive change. It's a targeted, very efficient application of the principles and taking advantage of opportunities. It's also more cost effective. Recycling materials. Urbanite is a wonderful example of this. This perhaps was once a solid concrete walkway, and instead of, or a driveway, and instead of having that type of landscape, we're breaking up that concrete. We're removing it, of course, but we're breaking it up, and then we're either relaying it with the gaps in between it, or we're using it in some other way in the landscape to create walls, etc. So thinking about how can we recycle the materials, the hardscape materials within a landscape, without having to toss them, and essentially making things more permeable, and even using urbanite to create fire breaks within a landscape. These are great opportunities for recycling. We can cut strips in concrete as well. In this example that you see here, it's a driveway, and we are cutting strips along the expansion joints in order to create more permeability in this once single, solid concrete area. By creating these gaps, we're directing water into the landscape, and we're allowing water to go into the soil. Acupuncture. Here's a great example of acupuncture. This driveway used to have a lot of cracks in it. And instead of taking up the whole driveway and having to relocate all that material within what's a relatively small landscape, uh, joints were cut. The cracks were actually turned into the benefit, the permeability of the driveway. The thing was stained with a concrete stain, and the gaps were made, and now you have something that's permeable. You didn't have to remove anything. It's a great solution for getting our objective, which is holding more rainwater in the landscape. And then there is just the understanding that if we start to think about the whole landscape as a sponge, we can actually hold on to water coming off the roof of buildings, even if we don't have gutters and downspouts. So this is really going toward the idea that building that healthy living soil, planting lots and lots of plants in the landscape, and turning that whole landscape into something that's a lot more permeable is going to give us the opportunity to essentially call the whole landscape our rainwater catchment area instead of just a basin or so forth. All right. I have a feeling this is going to be a pretty contentious area, and I hope you will ask lots of questions and make lots of comments with Mary Ann behind the scenes. Uh, this is about the plants in conventional landscapes, existing landscapes, and the question is always, should I stay or should I go now? Because if I go, there will be trouble, but if I stay, it will be double. What should stay in the landscape? Let's just take a look at some of the traditional plants that we might be overlooking in our quest to have that chaparral aesthetic. We may be overlooking some of these plants because, especially when they're in community, especially when they're in living soil, they can actually become quite drought tolerant. Daylilies. I know. I think there's probably going to be a flurry of exclamation points in the Q&A. But daylilies are often overlooked as essentially drought tolerant additions into the landscape. They they have a benefit in that you can actually divide them and move them around the landscape. There are many, many different kinds of daylilies. They do go through a period where they're not blooming, and so they're just green swards. And you have to look at the dead leaves and make sure that you have a way of recycling them. But especially in a rain garden or near a rain garden, these are terrific plants for traditional landscapes. Agapanthus. I am going to be honest with you that I spent 25 years removing agapanthus. I saw them as nothing but water hogs. I told clients that they were water hogs. And then I stepped back and said, okay, is this my aesthetic bias getting in my way? And I realized, no, agapanthus have a lot of adaptations that make them low water requiring plants. They can take water. So if you are irrigating a lot and applying a lot of water to them, they will happily take it, and they may even look better with that water as they adapt in a landscape. But they can actually survive quite well on the same amount of water as any moderate or even low water requiring plant could. They also have the benefit of being able to be divided and moved around. They take partial shade. And when they are blooming, they are amazing on the dining room table as cut flowers. Alströmerias. Alströmerias always make me personally quite happy. Again, never planted these things. I will credit my colleague Marilee Kuhlman for opening my eyes to the value of Alströmerias. They are a super tough and drought tolerant plant, beautiful cut flowers, very long lasting cut flowers. They are winter deciduous, so it's advantageous to plant them with something that is doing its thing in the winter. But remember, we're not doing monocultures anymore. We are doing lots of planting and adding things in. They do require full sun, and once again, you can divide them and move them around the landscape. Yeah, alströmerias are really a very happy plant in a landscape. Oh, I'm going to get it now. Dietes. Uh, I think this is one plant that when I came to Southern California and started learning about plant material, I suddenly saw this everywhere. I mean, every gas station had it. Every 7-Eleven had dietes in it. Um, and I completely dismissed it. Every single commercial landscape that we saw, I looked at it as a sloppy and essentially landscape designers, landscape architects phoning in a landscape when I saw dietes. But again, when I removed my bias about aesthetics and I stepped back, I realized, well, wait a second. This is an incredibly versatile plant, very, very drought tolerant, blooms almost nonstop, whether it's this variety or a variegated variety or the more yellow one. They are really nonstop bloomers. They can be cut. The cut plants, you can divide them and add them into the landscape, move them around. It can be an incredibly valuable plant, and it gives you a grassy look when you need that kind of a look to complement something else that's going on. Camellias. Oh, I am going to publicly apologize to the many clients that I convinced to remove their camellias. That was before I went to Descanso Gardens and really sat in the camellia forest and realized how drought tolerant camellias are, especially when they're in community and especially when they're planted in the way that they want to be, which is with a little bit of shade and abundantly mulched, not have their flowers removed quickly from the ground, all that debris. They love living in their debris. And as you see at Descanso Gardens, they love living in oak tree debris. And there's a symbiosis there that is undeniable. It's an incredible camellia forest in the oaks. And they can easily be overwatered and harmed by being overwatered. So this is something I think that we should maybe reconsider, is the value of camellias, and especially when they're mature. This is a very, very valuable kind of plant, whether it's ground cover or shrub or tree. Hydrangeas. Oh, I do hope it's blowing up in the in the Q&A. I didn't understand. I went to the Getty Museum's installation 25 years ago or more at the Getty Center, and I saw a landscape designer who wasn't really a landscape designer. It was a person who was an artist, but didn't really have experience in landscapes, had planted in full sun in really unbelievable conditions this mass of azaleas. And I turned my nose and said, this is not attractive to me. And it still challenges me aesthetically. But my experience now with plants like hydrangeas and azaleas in the right place, which is filtered light. At the coast, a little bit more sun, but as you get inland, it definitely needs to be in filtered light. Well mulched, well compost, irrigated efficiently with drip irrigation or a hand watering. These things are super drought tolerant. My own personal experience with hydrangeas of this kind was that I inherited a 1940s house with giant hydrangea bush in the front of it. They were something I was accustomed to, having come from the East Coast. I knew hydrangeas. I loved them as cut flowers, as dried flowers, and I kept the shrub in the front of my house, full sunlight, and never once watered it, and it did great. It had no access to supplemental water, and it was perfectly fine as a mature plant. So while I might not plant them anew in a mature garden, a conventional garden, I would value them for their aesthetic value that I just mentioned. Ferns are something that are often affiliated with a kind of tropical or wet environment. But in Southern California, we have quite a few ferns that are actually extremely drought tolerant, even California native dry shade ferns, the chain fern, the sword fern. These are things that give us a look of lushness, but actually thrive in very difficult conditions like the under trees and in filtered light. And where I used to remove a lot of this type of plant material in favor of getting some ribes in there or getting heucheras in there. Now I realize, no, this is a really super valuable green ground cover and should not be disturbed if possible. We can add into the landscape in layers things like the acalysia and the heucheras. They look really super delicate, but they don't need a lot of water. These are native plants or related to native plants. But adding them into a conventional landscape that doesn't predominantly have natives is something we should consider, because here what we're doing is we're layering and we're starting to create this complexity, and we're introducing some native plants into the mix. That tropical and dry look, in order to get that, philodendrons cannot be beaten. The Monstera deliciosas, the philodendrons, these are plants also that look like they need a lot of water, and in many conventional gardens are getting a lot of water, so they're adapted to that. But with the right approach of limiting that water with mulching and so forth, these things become super drought tolerant. Canna lilies are the same. Very, very drought tolerant plants. And when I say drought tolerant, I mean that they don't need summer water. When they're when they're in healthy soil and they've got the winter rains or winter water, canna lilies just keep going strong. I mean, does the foliage sometimes look a little burned in the very, very hot sun? Sure. They're probably better in a partial shade situation. And they do go winter dormant, so they're going to, for the most part, they're going to die back to the ground. But this is a plant that can be utilized as a drought tolerant plant or in a drought tolerant context to reduce our water requirement without sacrificing, the foliage and flowers. And we see them in a lot of conventional landscapes. What about boxwood? I mean, the problem with boxwood is it's always clipped, and that clipping makes the plant need more water. But they don't need to be hedged. We can actually encourage property owners to let these plants express themselves in the shapes that they are meant to be. Escallonia is another wonderful example of a plant that I can't tell you how many tons of Escallonia plant material I have ripped out in my career. And yet, if they were left to their own devices, not constantly clipped, allowed to become drought tolerant, they would do so. Rhaphoplepsis. I had an epiphany about 15 years ago working on a project with Surfrider Foundation and CNPS. It was at a site doing a demonstration garden, and there was Rhaphoplepsis in the landscape. And the consensus was, it's out of here. This is a plant we don't need. The challenge is that I arrived at the site and the Rhaphoplepsis wasn't in bloom, and all I saw was this leaf structure. And it took me more than a minute to realize that it wasn't a California native plant. It took me a minute to realize that it was who it was. And in that moment, I also realized, aesthetically, it actually fits with a lot of the native plant palette that we are promoting. And if it's not clipped regularly, it will bloom and it will produce, something very beautiful potentially. and it won't require as much water. So maybe it just needs to be managed better. And that was a revelation for me. And I want to share that revelation with you. Rhaphoplepis could have a place in our landscapes, at least not to be removed. Pittosporum, Pittosporum, especially the Tabiras, these plants are way overused, right? We see them in all of these conventional landscapes, but why are they inherently bad? They're not inherently bad. You know, the variegated version of this can be really great in a shady situation. They've just been managed poorly. They've been too cut. And of course, they've been allowed to have lots of dead material on the inside, so there's only green on the outside. If these plants are renovated in a conventional landscape, they can be a really great addition and a great evergreen foundation to a beautiful landscape. And on top of it, they smell absolutely amazing when they bloom. So again, not just disqualifying a plant because we think it's going to be water consuming, but rather looking at the situation and saying, why is this plant consuming so much water? Is it that it's alone and it needs friends? Is it that it's being pruned too frequently and so it requires water? Is it in a bare soil condition and so it's struggling to mine nutrients and to actually feed itself? You know, if those conditions, is it in too much sun, or is it in, is it in too deep shade? Let's look at these conditions first before we say just take it out. So the bottom line here is from this discussion that any garden really could become a lot more resilient if we started thinking about adding layers to that garden, adding diversity to that garden. Of course, we can introduce plants that are from the chaparral and California native plant palette. And we can also think about, some of these others that I've discussed. Even roses, especially the hybrid teas, have been much aligned because they have been coddled by generations of rosarians who think they need to be coddled. Actually, even though you will find wild roses growing in a riparian condition, right at the side of the creek and tolerating that beautifully, you can also find roses in very, very dry conditions. And although many of them have been bred to require more water or to need more special attention, we can start to think about how do we make sure that we get that soil around these roses as healthy as possible to give them the defense shield to fight off invaders, to fight off the pathogens? How do we make sure that they're getting the right amount of water right at their root zone, so it's not spraying the leaves, it's not spraying the flowers, it's delivering that water where it's needed into the microbiome at the roots of the plants? How do we keep the roots of roses cool so that the part above can be in the hot sun and can be delivering all these beautiful flowers? And really thinking about, again, layering and adding diversity into even rose gardens. We can start to underplant roses with things like catmint or convolvulus or oregano or germander, the more dwarf kind, and keep a living ground cover going underneath the roses. One of the biggest misconceptions about rose planting, it's just like camellias, is that you have to remove any plant material, any leaves that maybe have any kind of disease on it, or you have to remove the flowers, if they're imperfect in any way. And you have to eliminate it. You have to get it out of the garden because it's going to infest the garden in some way. Well, when we start to think about adding plants in, layering, creating companions for the roses, and building that healthy soil, we are going to actually encourage the chopping and dropping of any pruning, the dropping of the leaves and the flowers onto the ground so that the microbiome can develop an immune system to the problems that it's facing. It's a different way of thinking about roses. Roses are hugely fertilized plants and they don't need it. If they have healthy soil, the fertilization goes out. It is, in fact, the fertilization that attracts the aphids in the first place. So let's get rid of it. Let's think about more. More is more. We can layer with other plants. This is the taller Teucrium. We've got gazanias and erigeron. I mean, there are many plants that we can use, but starting to think about this layering. Ground covers, many of which are California natives, the Lysingea, the Fragaria. We could even put Lippia underneath some of these plants. Now, there's going to be some management to Lippia, or maybe we go with, with succulents like the Senecio or Echeverias. These are all options for layering in these landscapes and creating more diversity, more root depth, more interest. This is a great example of a landscape that is, a conventional landscape. There's a lot of control going on here, and at the same time, and this is outside the room, as you can see, we have ground covers that are added into the landscape, creating more diversity. We've got Santolina and Callilophus here, one of my favorite ground covers, and it's creating interest and it's creating more complexity. Liriopes in shade, with the camellias, with the oak trees, with the other plant material that's going on in shade and part shade. This is helping to create ground cover, holding on to water. Bulbs are a great option. And I know, what we're showing here are tulips. Consider where true tulips are from. It's actually really dry conditions. They do get a freeze or a cold, which can limit their ability to expand, over time there, if they don't get that chill. But there are many, many other bulbs that can be put into the landscape to add diversity, ranunculus and daffodils and even crocus. They may not even come up all the time, but when the conditions are right, they will. Irises, another great thing that we can add into the landscape. That gives us the color, and it also is boosting that diversity. And of course, selecting California native bulbs is a great idea. Let's add more of the alliums or the calicortus. This is, also just a great landscape plant for underplanting. The leopard lily, I haven't really seen it do exceedingly well in garden conditions. That's a thing that needs to be put into that partial shade and just forgotten. But there are many other bulbs that we can add into the landscape, giving us diversity. So back to the question of, should I stay or should I go? Let's remember that if it's should I go, in other words, it should be edited or removed from the landscape, there will be trouble. But then again, if I stay, it will be double. This speaks for itself. Should I stay or should I go now? I hope this isn't in a fire zone. Let's consider removing and really, getting quite serious about the flammable trees and shrubs in our landscape, but not just coming out with a chainsaw and getting rid of everything. Eucalyptus, for example, is on this list. And yet in recent fires in Southern California, lots of eucalyptus were left standing and relatively undamaged while houses burned to the ground. How is it possible? I thought eucalyptus exploded. Well, they were managed in a way that allowed the eucalyptus to withstand fire, which is not uncommon in its native environment. They were limbed up 30 feet. And so, yes, the trunks got scarred or got burned a little, but the canopy never caught fire. There are plants, however, that, unless managed very, very, very carefully, there's always going to be a fire consideration with them. Palm trees are an excellent example of this. We saw in recent fires just the thousands, hundreds of thousands of embers that came from one palm tree burning. Cypress, junipers, plants that have a lot of dead plant material on the insides of them as they grow. Pine trees. These are challenges because even though pine duff is a very good suppressor of of weeds and keeps the soil cool underneath, pine is very slow to decompose. And so as a result, even after 15 years, let's say, of pine debris building up, you can still have viable, undecomposed pine leaves at the bottom of the pile. In order to have a fire resistant landscape, you need to have that healthy living soil, cool soil, moist soil, but you also need to have debris that is decomposing. So if it's not actively decomposing, that's a challenge. So each of the plants that you see here in this list are ones that we can consider removing because they are particularly vulnerable in our climate where we do have the kinds of fire we have. There's some things that because of initial placement, because of management over time, they just can't be saved. And things is in quotes because when I looked at this, I said, oh, poor thing, not poor ficus. We can consider recycling green waste in interesting ways. Stumperies can be a design feature. Yes, even in landscapes that burn, this is something that we can think about. How do we use the debris in the landscape? Are there ways to create not just visual interest, but also habitat? And are there ways to keep it away from structures, etc.? Hugelkultur is something that we really need to bring into almost every existing landscape. Certainly for new building, it's great if we are going to remove plant material, we get to recycle that plant material directly into the ground. But also hugelkultur could be used to create rainwater catchment areas or contouring on an existing landscape because we can be building up and keeping all of the debris that all the organic debris that we're taking off a site now, instead keeping it on site. Using that debris as nurse logs, burying it into bioswales that we create. This is a way to kind of manage our conventional landscape without, again, removing everything from the site. And in practice, it's not that difficult to do, even having logs from trees that we've removed, defining pathways, become seeding areas, become mounds that we are going to plant on to create that topography. And really, it's a way to honor trees and plants in our landscape. We're recycling it back into the earth, and it keeps all the carbon on site. This is a totally legitimate thing, even though these pictures are showing it in the context of a landscape where plant material was removed and we started afresh. It also is applicable in a landscape that's an existing landscape. Now, I'm talking about layering, I'm talking about fire zones, and I'm talking about limiting pruning, but that doesn't mean that we don't prune at all, especially in fire zones. But we do need to manage these landscapes. Judicious pruning is necessary sometimes for the health of the plant, but for our health, we want to avoid fire ladders. So a key component to avoiding a fire ladder is making sure that our trees are limbed up high enough off the ground. A third of the height of the tree is the minimal amount that um, that should be removed, where the canopy is reduced and it's all pushed up. It's called lifting a skirt on a tree. That's all pushed up so that the canopy is not intersecting the shrubs that are beneath it. And the same thing with our shrubs, making sure that they also are limbed up so that they don't all blend into each other. This doesn't mean that there aren't multiple kinds of shrubs and biodiversity and complexity in this landscape. It just means that we are thinking about how fire would move through the landscape, and we're doing judicious pruning. What happens to the pruning that we do? Are we carting it away? No, we're thinking about how we get it back in the ground. Is it a hugelkultur thing? Is it a chip thing? Is it a chop and drop thing? All of those are legitimate ways to manage this this type of complexity. And hiring licensed professionals when we do the pruning, so that we don't stress the trees, we don't create a situation that makes the trees and by association our landscapes more vulnerable. Definitely ending pruning while we're in drought. When we are in a drought period, pretty much all pruning except for the dead, diseased, deranged, and damaged that's the only reason you should prune anyway, but really, really limited in your pruning in drought periods. Why? Well, because when we are pruning, that plant is now needing water in order to heal itself. Not just regrow, but actually heal the places that have been pruned. And it stresses the plant. And of course, the drought is also stressing the plant. So when you have those considerations, it shuts down its energy that it's normally sending to its root structure to manage the soil microbiome. And what you end up getting is a reduction in the microbiome. And remember, everything comes from the microbiome. So if the plant isn't able to manage its microbiome, then it becomes weaker. It becomes even more prone to pests, to disease, and it's a never-ending cycle. So don't prune in drought. So what about keeping the lawn? Doing a time check. How many clients have you said, not just in residential, of course, but also in commercial sites, that they want to keep the lawn? Under our current paradigm, it's really not possible because we are legitimizing the removal of the lawn for the implementation of this more kind of chaparral aesthetic. And that is a legitimate transformation, but maybe not for everybody. Of course, monoculture lawns are absolutely not sustainable under really any circumstances because they are requiring all these inputs. They're not complex enough. A monoculture, anything has that problem, but a monoculture lawn especially is going to require the input of fertilizers, the input of herbicides and pesticides in order to maintain that monoculture aesthetic. And so as a result, you cannot reduce the amount of water, no matter how efficient you get at applying the water. You can't really get below a threshold because the plant is always going to need that extra water just by virtue of the fact it's in monoculture. A very simple thing that we could do in an existing lawn, really without any other addition, is overseeding with some clover. And even preferably something more than a single kind of clover. This actually has multiple benefits to this idea of transforming conventional landscapes. First of all, clovers are legumes, and when they are put into a landscape, situation like the grass, which is predominantly a carbon sequesterer, the legumes can actually pair with that carbon sequestering plant to produce nitrogen. And when they're producing nitrogen, they're basically exchanging it for the carbon in the grass. And so the two together have a symbiotic relationship and actually create something that is a lot more resilient than either of them trying to live on their own. Another reason that you can start to encourage clover is because it is a first step toward no longer having that lawn that is just a green space where everything that is not, an upright blade of green is being eliminated. So this is a way to start to change the aesthetics and the appreciation of a client away from monoculture and into something that is much more interesting. It's kind of a first step to having a landscape that is much more diverse. So starting with the lawn, and also again, it doesn't just have to be like a white clover. There are many kinds of clovers and pinks and micro clovers and red clover, and all of these things can really add interest into the landscape. Adding into the grass native grasses and yarrows is one way that we can start to increase the diversity of the grass itself. Um, taking advantage of places where the monoculture is not thriving and thinking, well, what are some things that we could add in here that would actually help either the grass to thrive a little better or would replace the grass in this area and create more diversity to the garden as a whole. Plugging into the grass directly with Carapia is something that I'm seeing more and more of in landscapes. Not even removing the grass, but just plugging right into it. The Carapia or Lipia is an incredibly aggressive spreader. It is it works in a sun or part shade condition, and it's a very, very fast grower. And while when you're plugging into an existing landscape, it may not actually completely take over that lawn, it will definitely fill in gaps where the lawn is not thriving. And over time, it may actually take over the thing where the lawn becomes a lot less prominent. And this is not just for cool season application. This is especially for a warm season situation. So, but then of course you're in the position of having to manage the Carapia. So be careful what you wish for. This concept of the aesthetic of creating something that's more untamed is, in our opinion, a first step to moving people away from a monoculture, away from this controlled kind of landscape, giving them permission to have more diversity, to have more root and leaf structure, um, uh, diversity. These are steps that we are helping people make. And by looking at the work of masters of this technique of using, a Mediterranean garden, and allowing it to be untamed. This is something I think that we can start to do, especially for commercial landscapes where we have the space to really explore adding trees, adding shrubs, and adding more grasses and perennials into it to make it more complex. Again, the work of Nigel Dunnett is something that, we do a lot of discussion of and exploration of this naturalistic planting design concept. Really boils down to, when it's combined with the watershed approach, it really boils down to having a more untamed vision, allowing a landscape in its complexity to express itself in these ways that are unpredictable. And in doing that, we are actually mimicking the California, native landscapes, although not so much chaparral, really more the grasslands. This particular installation of Nigel Dunnett's at the Tower of London was inspired by a trip that he took to California and observed our super bloom. And coming back to England, began to think about how to recreate that aesthetic using plants that would work in succession with each other and that would become a much, much more complex ecosystem. It's worth mentioning that this particular installation, it was not a moat. I mean, it was a moat like, 500 years ago, but when Nigel Dunnett approached it, it was grass. It was all grass. And the approvals for this particular landscape took a long time in coming. And it was a massive project. It was being done for Queen Elizabeth II's. I don't remember exactly which anniversary, but it was one of the anniversaries or a birthday, an anniversary of her time on the throne. And so the time frame got really compressed, and there wasn't time or budget to remove the grass. And so in some places, grass was judiciously removed, but for the most part, it was kept in place, and soil was brought in and mounded on top of the grass, and then the planting went into that. So this was a perfect example of adding into a landscape. And eventually that grass converted into soil, and now this ecosystem is the dominant ecosystem. So in the pursuit of a new aesthetic, perhaps we let go of perfect and we start to, mix and match plants and maybe even encourage forbs. Forbs are broadleaf weeds. I just like to call them forbs instead of weeds, but encourage them into the lawn so that we are starting to get that complexity. In terms of managing a lawn, so that even if we're going to keep it in a much more kind of monoculture aesthetic or just in a monoculture, managing the lawn is really critical. So aerating that lawn annually is something that needs to be done. And this is a manual aerator on a commercial site or a larger site. There are walk behind core aerators or drive core aerators. The key here is that we're not just making holes into the landscape, we're actually removing these plugs. And again, we are mimicking the work of worms in doing this. And by removing those plugs, we're creating oxygen channels for water to get down into the soil. I want you just to take a quick look at those plugs that are coming out. You can see that they look pretty compacted. Now, there might be some roots in those, but it's not like a dense root system happening here. And if it is, it's pretty narrow, it's a pretty shallow root system. So this definitely needs to have aeration on a regular basis to be healthy. Dethatching is something that also should happen while the lawn is improving. So the issue with thatch is that as it builds up, it actually contributes to compaction because it keeps water from getting into the landscape. It keeps oxygen from getting into the landscape. And you may say, well, why is this stuff building up? Like, what's that about? Isn't that just the way grass is? No, actually, in a really healthy biome or with a really healthy biome, this grass would not have the thatch on it, or would have minimal thatch, because where that thatch touched the soil, there would be decomposition of that dead material. And because the soil microbiome is not really rocking in this landscape, and of course, how can it when it's a monoculture? But because it's not rocking, that thatch is not decomposing. So we need to remove it. We need to redistribute it in the landscape. We need to cycle it through compost or something in order to get the availability, allow the availability of oxygen and water to get into the soil so that the microbiome can improve. And after doing any kind of disturbance like this, dethatching and core aeration, we're going to immediately follow up with some compost, because now we've disturbed the soil. We need to get organic matter in there to help the microbiome, reestablish itself. And again, because it's predominantly a monoculture in this context, we need to give it help. So we're going to rely on that decomposition pathway to keep the soil healthy, because remember, in a monoculture, we're not really getting that liquid carbon pathway very well. Now, you're going to say, well, wait a second, just 10 minutes ago, you were telling me when you were talking about clover that grass was an excellent carbon sequesterer. How do these two things make sense? You're saying now that a monoculture of grass is not good at liquid carbon pathway, of putting carbon into the ground? And the answer is, yeah, these two things are not mutually exclusive. Just because the plant has the capability of expressing itself in a particular way, doing large amounts of carbon sequestration, being drought tolerant, being salt tolerant, being cold tolerant, being heat tolerant, just because it has that genetic propensity doesn't mean it gets expressed. In monoculture, it's unlikely that those characteristics are going to be expressed. In order for genetic predispositions like an adaptation that can lead to adaptation, in order for those to be expressed, you need polyculture. You need multiple species in the same space. So we're just going to do our best to manage the water that's applied here. We're going to get some uh, uh, organic matter to begin decomposing and helping that microbiome along a little bit. We're going to keep that aeration mimicking worms. We're going to keep dethatching, getting rid of the overload of undigested organic material. Remember here, I'm not saying put down mulch on top of this, which is undigested organic material. I'm saying feed with worm castings or compost, which is already digested and ready to go for the microbiome. So these are really things for us to be thinking about when we're analyzing landscapes. It's not the conventional way of thinking about it is actually something that needs to be updated to be more, watershed wise. With regard to mowing, we really need to stop the very low mowing of our grass areas. It's one of the main reasons that we have uh, such a high water requirement, that the grass is difficult to manage aesthetically. I mean, take a look at this landscape. And first of all, you can see, I mean, it looks pretty darn healthy. It's kept at 4 to 7 inches tall. And oh, by the way, look out into the distance here. Doesn't it look like a monoculture? But when you look up close to what's happening right here, you can see, no, there's actually microclover and clovers in there that are helping keep this grass green. This is an excellent example of what we really want our very most basic grass situation to look like, and 4 to 7 inches is where grass should be mowed. Well, not finally, but finally for the main part of the talk, we want to talk about the nightmare of irrigation. We have designed these landscapes with the belief and determination that they must be irrigated. And because we've done that, the irrigation, not just industry, but the whole idea of a landscape without irrigation is almost unthinkable in Southern California. Um, so what has happened over time is that irrigation that irrigation has been prompted by regulation and by this aesthetic change to a more chaparral environment. Irrigation has been prompted to update itself. Do those updates happen in a way that would essentially eliminate irrigation? Not really. Those updates are new and improved versions of things. Small movements toward efficiency, toward creating a system that is actually delivering the right amount of water to the landscape and only to the landscape when it is required. And if you're going to have an irrigation system, that's the ideal. When you see images like this, especially in conventional landscapes, you know that the irrigation is a challenge, because all this hardscape that you would have in a landscape is being damaged by the irrigation system. If you don't want to address irrigation for any other reason, this is a very good dollars and cents reason to be thinking about changing the irrigation. Distribution uniformity is absolutely essential. Even when I started teaching distribution uniformity, because I was creating landscapes that were not the kind of conventional type of landscape, because I was creating landscapes anew and really installing, eliminating irrigation systems altogether, and then coming back with brand new drip systems really from the valve forward. I wasn't really concerned about distribution uniformity. It was something really, in my mind, relegated only to spray irrigation and relegated to grass. And that is still largely true, that a grass dominant landscape is going to really need to have good distribution uniformity. And that a spray system is something that requires good distribution uniformity. But it's also true for drip irrigation, which we'll show in a second. Here's an excellent example of, this is a new and improved, updated irrigation system. And we didn't address the design aspect of it. So the brief here was to upgrade the nozzles and make sure that the height of the pop-up was correct, but we didn't actually address the placement of the conventional landscape or the conventional irrigation system. And this has been in place for many, many, many years, as evidenced by the hardscape and as evidenced by the lack of growth of the grass where the water should be going. The roots want the water, not the trunks of the trees. And even when we do drip, I mean, what are they thinking? It's very, very, very difficult to retrofit irrigation systems in an existing landscape. It's really a challenge. It takes sitting down and really thinking through what your objectives are, and planning things out very, very carefully. The pull to just eliminate everything is very, very strong for good reason. Hydrozoning, which is an essential part of designing your irrigation system, is really a challenge. If it was not designed properly to begin with for the landscape that was installed, it's going to be difficult down the road to try to make changes. Not, you know, not the least of your problems is the fact that irrigation systems are pipes in the ground. You have an existing landscape, so how much are you going to dig up? But in this particular case, we have a existing irrigation system on this landscape that was essentially two zones. There was a lawn zone with the spray, and then there was the everything else zone, which was drip and actually was a spray system everywhere else. And that simply isn't sufficient. If we really want to up the game in this conventional landscape, we need to add hydrozones here so we have more control over the water that's being applied in each of these areas, and that application of water is matching the demand that the plant material in that particular zone has. So instead of two zones, we really need 5. How are we going to go about doing that? Um, we need to think about this, very carefully and start to prioritize, because it's not just time, but it's also going to dig up the garden and it's going to be expensive to do. One simple thing that we can start to think about in a conventional situation is where we have trees, where we have shrubs, and especially if they are in or adjacent to grass, pulling back the grass um, to the drip line of those plants. And it doesn't even need to be uh, a outright removal of the grass, although that perhaps would be, the easiest thing to do. It could just be a heavy mulching on top of the grass out to that drip line, and the elimination of mowing and all that sort of stuff within the drip line of the tree. So starting to think about this transition of the grass area, and especially where we overlap with more complex plant material, how do we start to make that transition? Mulching to the drip line is one way we start. And then adding an additional irrigation valve, a drip irrigation valve, that only brings water to the trees and large shrubs. We can actually transition spray irrigation to drip lines for shrub areas. But when we do that, we also need to cover everything with a good thick application of mulch. Those drip lines should not be exposed to the sunlight. And of course, these plants would definitely benefit from having lots of mulch. So you get a twofer. Now, just because it's drip doesn't mean you're not going to get runoff. When you install drip irrigation, make sure that you are checking and thinking about precipitation rates. There is a myth that because we're switching from spray irrigation into drip, it's going to be more efficient. And in reality, precipitation rates could be just as high as spray irrigation with incorrect installation. And we could see runoff. And we could also see problems, back further within the irrigation system, not just at the emitters, but at the valves. So when we are changing out from existing spray heads and so forth, we're going to need to replace the valves as well. Now we're starting to get into money. We're starting to get into, in complexity of design. But remember, the title of this section is The Nightmare of Irrigation. Yes, in order to have drip irrigation in your landscape, you need to have a low flow valve. We have done really countless retrofits where we've kept valves in place, we've added pressure regulation, we've added filtration onto the existing valves, but because we didn't have low flow valves, in many cases, the valve itself was not detecting the low flow going through the drip, and they would actually stick in an open position. This, this has been the source of many hours of despair with retrofitting irrigation systems. So we really need to think about this aspect. And also, uh, fixing problems, making sure that our managers of our systems are out there and actively looking at the systems running, and tuning them up on a regular basis. Just because an irrigation system is efficient when it's installed, but especially for an existing landscape that's been around a while, these things need to be looked at regularly. It's not once a year, it's at minimum once a quarter and maybe even more frequently than that. And oh, by the way, especially if the landscaping is being interacted with by people running around or by automobiles, maybe getting close to them or whatever. Now, yes, rotating sprinkler nozzles are a lot better. This trajectory, stream, water streams, are a lot better. They apply water more slowly, more uniformly. This, in general, encourages healthy plant growth. We highly recommend it. And yet, you keep the emitter against a hardscape surface. Now you're having a spray head that is an efficient nozzle delivering water for 15 minutes along a hardscape surface and overspraying for 15 minutes. You know, this is a very, very, very typical installation in a conventional landscape, and not just in a lawn landscape. You see even shrub heads and pop-up heads right against the hardscape or within just a couple of inches of the hardscape. And there is no way this can actually be eliminating runoff or ultimately efficient. This is poor design. It's the conventional design. It's the approved conventional design, but it's poor design. We need to actually add swing joints onto our irrigation systems so that we can move these nozzles, move the heads away from hardscape. An 18-inch gap is good. 24 inches is even better. But yeah, moving it away from the very edge of the surface and creating setbacks from hardscape that can actually be planted. And we can use drip irrigation or even no irrigation in those areas. This is an opportunity for adding diversity. It's an opportunity for getting the property owner accustomed to the idea of, grass doesn't just come up to hardscape surfaces. There is a transition. There is something more interesting going on here. Pressure regulation should be a no-brainer in all the landscapes, certainly for new installations, but for our existing landscapes, pressure regulation is one thing that we know is going to improve the water efficiency of that landscape, and making sure that the pressure is proper for whether or not we are using spray, multi-trajectory rotating nozzles, or drip irrigation. The pressure is important. Having active irrigation management, even when we have a weather-based irrigation controller, eyes on the irrigation. It's unlike the system that's in a home, let's say, where the piping is all on the walls and we're just going to kind of forget how water gets distributed. In outdoors, the piping is in the ground. If we have any kinds of issues with that piping, we are going to see massive leaks. We're going to see decrease in efficiency right away. And then from the actual using of the water through the timer, we can have a huge effect on how much water we're using. And so getting control of the timer is, I mean, it's a one place where control is really great. And really thinking through, okay, now we've added new plants into the landscape. How does that affect our irrigation schedule? We are separating out perhaps trees and shrubs from ground covers and other things that maybe don't have the same root depth. How does that affect our irrigation schedule? How do we manage seasonal adjustments so that we're sure to be irrigating in wintertime when many of our drought tolerant plants, not just the California natives, are adapted, those Mediterranean plants are all adapted to to wetter winters and drier summers. So if we're not getting the rain, in the wintertime, making sure that that irrigation is happening in the wintertime. And seasonal adjustments. Hey, when the sun is not up in the sky, when the days are shorter, those plants are not requiring the water. Let's make sure that our irrigation is matching that. And as good as weather-based irrigation control is, it still is using an algorithm that is pushing things toward a baseline. Your landscape is unique to your place. And so having that hands-on management is really an important aspect of making a conventional landscape more, watershed wise. Cycling and soaking is absolutely important. See, look at those spray heads right against the hard end, and they're only 4 inches tall. And now we're going to be managing the grass to 4 to 7 inches. How does that work? So yeah, those spray heads actually should be retrofit into 6-inch heads and pulled away from the edge of the hardscape. And then also using the irrigation controller to adjust your irrigation time so that you minimize runoff. And the way you do that is with cycling and soaking. So you only have the irrigation on for a short period of time, applying the water, and then you allow a period of time for it to soak in, and then you apply more water after that soaking. Making sure that any retrofits we're doing into our landscapes are with the most efficient, the most updated equipment that we possibly can. And the way that we do that is looking to the WaterSense label. All of these components of the irrigation system have, especially, these are timers, but there are other components as well, the soil moisture sensors and so forth. These need to be tested. The WaterSense program has actually tested this equipment and determined that use of this equipment will reduce your water use by 20% compared to a similar product that has not met the criteria. So go with the WaterSense label for everything that you can. Now, finally, all of this conversation of working with conventional landscapes has been in the service of complexity and trying to treat gardens more as ecosystems and less as, art pieces that are being created and left to degrade. When we design for complexity, we're looking at the landscape and we're asking ourselves the question, how are we maximizing the solar energy collection of this landscape? And what collects solar energy in a landscape? Well, certainly things that you immediately think of, like solar panels and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that is maximizing solar energy collection. Absolutely. But the coolest solar panel there is a plant leaf. Plants thrive on solar power. In fact, they are actually feeding themselves with solar power, maximizing the opportunity to gather that solar energy in the landscape has so many benefits. And the way we do that is by maximizing planting, having as much plant material as we possibly can in the landscape. How do we maximize on-site water collection? And more than collection, cycling, because we're not just collecting the water, as you know, as we discussed earlier, we're not just collecting that water so that it can sit in a container or even so that it can sit in the ground. The purpose of collecting the water is so the plants can access it and cycle the water back up into the atmosphere, which means that we are actually impacting weather systems by putting moisture back into the what's called the small water cycle, which is the water cycle over terrestrial areas, over land areas. And so when we think about water in the landscape, it's not just how much water does a plant need? You know, how much does it require? Or how much are we applying in the case of irrigation? Or how much water can we capture from the sky? Those are all components of how much water can we cycle? How do we keep it moving? And the solar energy collection and the water cycling are linked absolutely together and interconnected, because it's the plants that are doing the cycling, and it's the plants that are fueling the whole pump on solar energy. How do we maximize the cycling of minerals and nutrients? Really, I put the word nutrients there because it's something that we're familiar with thinking about plant food as nutrient, but it's really how do we maximize the cycling of minerals. The minerals are being mined from the soil, from the rock, from the site by the microbiome that is associated with the plants. When the plants are dense and highly diverse with both their solar panels and their root systems, the mining of minerals is much more efficient, and those plants are able um, to aggregate those minerals in their bodies. They're able to utilize the material that's been mined to grow, flower, fruit, and be healthy. Remember the Brix level. Their Brix levels are increasing, which means they are actually fighting off pests and pathogens. Maximizing the cycling of minerals is all coming from the soil. Everything that's coming from the soil is coming from the subaquatic environment in which all these critters are swimming around, and it's fueled by solar energy pumping through the roots of the plants. And then, not really finally, because it's an interconnected circle, but the other bit of complexity that we want to be thinking about is how do we maximize the conditions for biodiversity? We've talked about having this density and diversity of plant material, and with that diversity and density of plant material, we are now linked to insects, birds, mammals, reptiles, everything, uh, microbiome inhabitants. They are all paired together. They are all working together in an absolutely beautiful and inextricable um, uh, system that we call a landscape. And so when we design for complexity, we step back from aesthetics. Aesthetics are important, but we also start to think about these other things and asking ourselves, how are we doing these things too? Because in doing these things, we get an aesthetic that is the ultimately best thing for our environment. Gardens are not islands, and they don't just exist, on our property. We live in the garden planet. uh, and every single garden, whether it is a conventional landscape or a brand new landscape that you have just designed and installed, they can all contribute something to the greater whole. Um, think about creating wildlife corridors, which is simply maximizing this interconnectedness that we just talked about. Are you a birder? Think about creating a wildlife corridor. How are you attracting more birds? What do you need to have? And don't forget all those underground corridors, the pathways, the multiplexes, the super highways, the dams, and the all the water storage, everything that's happening underground, it mimics above ground. Add trees. Can't say enough how wonderful it is that Metropolitan has their tree bait. Putting more trees into the landscape is really essential, but not just because they're trees, right? Yes, adding trees is great. Adding all plants is great. But the reason that we're saying add trees here is because trees in landscapes, especially the type of landscapes that we see in urban settings, residential and even small commercial settings, there's a fear of trees. They're going to damage our infrastructure. They're going to drop their leaves. Oy, isn't that terrible? They're going to have birds in them that are going to make nests and maybe drop their droppings onto my hardscape. There are lots of reasons that people, especially those drawn to conventional landscapes, are trying to eliminate trees or minimize their trees. This is a place where we can really make a difference by adding more trees into the landscape. We are adding a huge amount of complexity. We're especially pushing on the biodiversity side, but it's also a giant cistern. It's maximizing solar radiation or solar collection, and it's that massive root system is mining just a huge amount of minerals to share with everybody else. Trees are critical for our landscapes. And you could even add a lot of trees in a very small area. Consider the Miyawaki forest method. I highly recommend that you take a look at it. This is essentially the idea that instead of just diversity of plant material, we are actually creating a huge diversity of tree material and creating multiple layers of trees within a very small area, super, super, super dense. And we get all the ecosystem benefits from this density in a very small place. So, your landscape or a landscape in a commercial site could have mini Miyawaki forests all over it and have a massive impact on all the goals that we are looking for: water conservation, stormwater management, biodiversity, and complexity. And oh, by the way, just really beautiful and fun to interact with. Everything is connected. We all need to find ways to get people into gardens, get them enjoying gardens. If they like a particular aesthetic that doesn't, conform with the thing that we would like them to like, hey, it's okay. Let's just get them in the garden and let's expand our view of what makes a watershed wise landscape. Well, I think I've left some time for questions and conversation. I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh my gosh.
And hopefully there was some dialogue.
Man, there was dialogue. This is maybe one of the more, I don't know if controversial is the right word. But we were definitely getting some interesting feedback. I'm going to talk about a couple of questions that just came up again and again in different ways. One of the big ones was this. Let's see if I can find a great way. So the idea, a couple of people asked about what they were seeing as a perceived conflict between your earlier statement about not spacing plants to their predictable mature size and not employing aesthetic pruning, because if we plant too close, then plants grow uncharacteristically tall. So it's this, we're seeing one thing, we're being told something else, mixed in
Yeah,
there is it gets messy, clients won't like it. So yeah, that was the crux of a lot of questions.
yeah. You know, welcome to the conundrum.
Yeah.
They're not mutually exclusive. So essentially, what I was talking about there is that um, in our pursuit of planting, to maturity, spacing. So when we're starting a new garden and we're planting, we're looking at the mature size, and so we're spacing appropriately. That has evolved as a practice into planting more minimally. And I will share with you a personal experience and part of my professional evolution. Uh, I was a landscape contractor with the thriving practice, um, for almost, I'm just thinking about 15 years before I met Marilee Coleman, who is a prominent Los Angeles-based landscape designer, highly accomplished horticulturalist. And uh, at the time, I was hating plants, but that's another story. Uh, something that happens a lot with landscape contractors, I find. But anyway, um, I met Marilee and I explored her gardens, and I actually started designing with her projects, working in tandem. And I would get very nervous and very frustrated because having really come to landscape design with no background in, I didn't have a horticultural degree. I was coming from reading about irrigation and about, sort of the theories of design and so forth. And I got very nervous working with her because she was planting so much stuff. I mean, I couldn't figure out how to break it down into what we now call the MWELO calculations. What were the plant factors? There were, all these different plants in one space. And it wasn't that there were a lot of the same plant in one space. I saw that in design all the time, and usually, a maintenance nightmare. This was more lots of layering of plants. So there would be, grasses or plants that were what I'm going to call ephemeral. They were only going to have a couple of year lifespan. And then there were, tender perennials, and then there were shrubs, and then there were trees. And it was just like this massive layering, and it created a really dense look. Very beautiful. But for someone who was concentrating on irrigating, concentrating on what I thought maintenance was going to be about, it made me extremely nervous to see it. And I successfully talked her into a period of time where she stopped planting that way. And we found when we went back and looked at the landscapes, the ones where we had stopped having that layers of complexity in it didn't look as good, hadn't thrived, were needing more water. And I think that just my personal experience with that led me to understand that sure, if you're going to be planting shrubs, you don't want them on top of each other. You don't want trees on top of each other. The foundational, the bones of a landscape, you want to have enough room. But that doesn't mean there aren't other kinds of plants that need to be in that ecosystem to maximize the ecosystem. So having ground covers, having smaller perennial shrubs and those ephemeral plants, the bulbs, that kind of stuff. That's really what I'm talking about. So it's not attention so much about the plant spacing and the pruning necessary. You still want to space properly. You just want to have more. And the question about it being messy and so forth, that's why we have to bring people forward with this kind of untamed and less controlled look. Because all of that control that is being exerted in the pruning is like anxiety reduction. Either on the part of the designer, contractor, maintenance person, or on the part of the property owner. There is an anxiety that is produced when things are untamed, when they're not accustomed to it, and their aesthetic hasn't developed beyond that. Oh, by the way, that's probably why they have a conventional landscape. They were afraid of the California landscape to begin with. Because of how untamed it is in reality. So I don't know, is that adding anything to the conversation, you think, Marianne? What do you think about that?
I was answering other questions, but certainly one of the things, and you may have just said it, I apologize, was it's also not an all or nothing. It doesn't have to be 1,000 species or 100 species. It can be, can we add some bulbs? Can we add some ground cover? And you're also looking at things in 3 dimensions. So we also tend to think that everything's at the same height, and it's not. You've got taller plants, you've got lower plants. Some of them are annuals. They will be gone in a season. Some of them don't grow more than 2 or 3 inches. And so I think it's all of these principles are gradations. What can you do that is a small improvement that makes things a little bit more diverse? And as Pamela noted, is if you go out into a garden that hasn't been, manicured to death, there will be no bare spaces. Nature abhors a void. So that's the other thing, is we keep coming back to, yes, we want our gardens to look just so, but at the end of the day, nature really is the great teacher. So if we want to do it right, if we want healthy and resilient gardens, that perhaps we need to expand our contemplation of what is possible.
Yep.
Let me add this question, because I read this one. We had all kinds of comments on it. And there's very much this California native, non-native. And so this one question came in, or this one comment. I understand about established plants and not wanting to uproot them, but we should be actively pushing native plants, not non-natives, which have 0 ecological benefits.
Well, it's just, I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure I know who said that.
There were
it's totally legitimate. Like, look, yes, of course, native plants. We want native plants. We want more of them. We want a lot more of them. But to say that non-native plants have 0 ecological benefit is just a completely incorrect statement. The science does not support that. The ecological benefits, first of all, I think a really important thing for us to remember is that soil determines the plant. Okay, it's an interactive relationship, of course, and chicken and egg to a certain extent. But when soil is
to launch the survey. Hold on one
second. Go ahead, do that. When soil is able, a plant will express itself when the soil is in a condition to allow the plant to express itself. This is why you can put down seed you can put native seed onto a landscape and see no natives come up. Why? Why is that? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Or only see like really ephemeral and very early succession seeds come up, let's just say. Why aren't we seeing the other seeds express themselves? It's because the soil is not at a state of complexity to allow those seeds to express themselves. And when the soil does get to that complexity, the seeds that are not native will not express themselves. An excellent example of this is the whole brassica conversation. I mean, we have this pretty much in every single time we talk about this. It's, you know, the weed seed bank, or what we call the weed seed bank. It's a Forbes seed bank of native or non-natives, and they're Forbes from both categories. They are waiting for disturbance. They're waiting to jump into action. They are stimulated by the condition of disruption to go into action, to do their thing. And most of them are very specialized creatures. So they have, they efficiently mine, one particular thing, or they have a root structure that does one particular thing and can access, a particular mineral or a particular condition. And so the Forbes will jump into action after disturbance. The seed bank is massively stimulated by that disturbance and by that very poor soil condition. And it takes a long, long time for that. If you do not disturb that weedy situation, it takes a really, really long time for that soil to actually get to a point where it is without disturbance, where it's complex enough to support the later succession plants. But if you have undisturbed um, undisturbed soil, the brassicas, like in the case of mustard, they don't have a job when the woody plants are able to get established. They're out of work. Why? Because the soil is already got a sufficient amount of this whatever it is. In the case of brassicas, I want to say calcium, but I don't think that's it. It's one of the other essential minerals for plants. But that brassica is doing that job. It can't do it doesn't have a need for it in the time when the soil is more complex, and so it does not express itself. That's the key, is understanding that aspect to it. So to say that other plants that aren't native to the it's not. No, it's not the case anymore. Why? Because it is disturbed beyond what it ever was before humans were even here. And oh, by the way, the kind of disturbance that it used to get, that used to kind of keep a system, either in grassland or in a more chaparral or, forest, whatever, the disturbances were animals. And we don't have animals anymore. You want to get rid of brassica, we better start grazing the heck out of the hillsides.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, because then
Yeah.
you would have native plants on the hillsides because they would be stimulated to grow in the improved soil and germinate in the improved soil.
All right. I'm going to do one more reminder because we sort of slipped it in for those of you that are still with us. I have posted a link to the survey. We would love to hear what your thoughts were. We've got some other questions, a couple more minutes. I've stopped answering anything that's been coming in. This question also came up in a few different ways. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. It came up in terms of trees, it came up in terms of native gardens and in traditional gardens. And that was the question about the maintenance on these types of gardens and how, whether we were calling them mow and blow, somebody called basically the idea that we don't have the trained folks out there to maintain the gardens, sometimes to install the gardens. And that sense of, it felt a little bit like we were just sort of throwing up our hands because what do we do? So I had my thoughts about that, but
Oh, you start.
also, so
Yeah.
first of all, this is not a question that can be answered simply. There are many, many moving pieces to this and a lot of complexity and a lot of different, it's a little bit like our ecosystem. And And it will definitely take a village to try to figure out how to resolve this. Some of the challenge is that clients potentially don't actually want to invest enough in the manpower, woman power in order to get the work done. We certainly see that in residential settings where you're used to paying $100 or $150 for some guy to come in for 20 minutes, and then they are disappointed because they don't get the fine, thoughtful landscape management that needs to be done. So absolutely, education is critical. It has to happen at all levels. And then the piece that just sort of came back to me was that we also have to take individual responsibility. So it's very easy to sit there and go, that's broken. I don't know what to do about it. It becomes somebody else's problem. And I think it's really, really important to go, how do we interact with the people that we work with? Is there an opportunity to come out to a job site? And if you know how to do something a little bit better, can you provide 30 minutes of training? Are you willing to pay to have your gardener or your maintenance staff go get the training? Because in many cases, they are working 6 days a week and they cannot afford to take a day off to get the training. So yeah, not a question with easy answers, but similarly, all the dilemmas, conundrums that are facing us is we really have to go, what can we personally do to help, solve some of this? Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really well said. I mean, was slightly more like just to add a little bit to that. We've been training professionals for 20 years now, almost. And a lot of what we encounter is a devaluation of the humans that provide these services. And that fundamental devaluation, not just of the humans, but of their skills or of their potential, and providing them an opportunities, to learn these techniques, is, it's a critical component of the whole puzzle. I remember the epiphany that I had on this, which came, first of all, the very use of a term mow and blow, I think is one of the, personally, I think is one of the most insulting things we could say, where, to reduce a living to that. Janitorial is maybe a better word. But the epiphany that I had on this was taking my car to a mechanic and looking at the labor prices for plugging my mostly computer compatible car into Toyota into a computer, and then reading out the the printout of what needed to be fixed or whatever, and getting the bill of more than $100 an hour for the labor. And it occurred to me, oh my gosh, we are asking people to have an understanding or familiarity with, I mean, what? Let's throw out a number, 25,000 plants. I don't know how many, in Southern California alone, of all, techniques for managing that, for social skills, for interacting with property owners, for skills for handling money, ordering things, managing logistics, maintaining equipment, hiring people. We're asking them to do it for $30 an hour, for $15 an hour. Yeah, our priorities just aren't right. You want to have better maintenance? We need to spend a lot more on maintenance. Right? That's it. When it becomes like a mechanic, you're going to attract people to that industry who want to achieve the or be aligned with our objectives. But until we get to that point, it's going to be fast food service.
Yeah. But it's right up there with all of the other challenges that we face. All right, let's see if there's anything. I mean, those were like the big ones. I think let me go ahead and ask this other question. So we were talking a little bit about, because I think people are very curious about this, the idea that you can overseed or plug into existing grass. And one gentleman mentioned that there were certain kinds of grasses, I think it was the kikuyu maybe, that if you don't keep it mowed short, you get a buildup of thatch. And so if you want to address that and why that actually is not an issue.
Horapia. Short answer.
Yeah. But I also, you were, when we've
But
done.
you can mow it short and you still have thatch. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's not really about the height that you're mowing it. It isn't. You can mow it to a half an inch and have thatch for the whole thing. It's about the soil health. If the soil health isn't there, the thatch doesn't decompose, etc. And the last time we saw Carapia taking over a grass landscape, it was a Kikuya base. So that's why I said that. It seems those two seem to be able to slug it out quite well. Yeah, I mean, look, they're no hard and fast. I mean, the whole purpose of this conversation is about exploring, looking at landscapes as an evolution, not a this or that, not a hey, it's just this moment in time. We only have this moment in time to make a difference in the future. No, it's a evolution, and people need to evolve, aesthetics need to evolve, industries, regulation, and the soil needs to evolve. All of it needs evolution so that we can support the things that can't evolve quickly. And the way that we do that, in our opinion, is by moving people along, introducing them to concepts, focusing on soil health, getting their existing conventional landscapes as healthy as possible, so that we conserve water, hold on to stormwater, and do all these things. And it's my belief, from like a psychological point of view, that in focusing on those things, we are actually evolving the whole industry more toward that ideal that we have. I never said the ideal wasn't great. I said we're not going to reach it if all we do is push that ideal. We have to have on-ramps for everybody else. So that's really what this is about. It's meant to be challenging. I do hope that you have gotten some brain stimulation out of it. We love the dialogue. We love the pushback. We love the discourse with just the amazing people that I'm seeing. The names of the people on here, I mean, this is high-level stuff. Please tell your other professional friends and allies to get, and maybe even people who aren't, to get on these professional trainings so we can have dialogues like this. I think the Q&A is the most interesting part of the whole thing, honestly. Goats Gone Wild, yes. I mean, we need so many animals in our natural systems. There's almost no way that we can achieve it without, starting to do some very, very radical alliances and disruptions of other industries, like the confined feeding operation industry, the food industry. If we were able to disrupt that in a meaningful way and get animals back on land, a lot of the issues that we are facing as landscapers and as concerned environmentalists would start to be addressed, and it would really be a good lift. So that's advocacy that runs in parallel, perhaps, to landscaping and natural system land advocacy. Um, uh, yes, and there's a whole thing about disruption and so forth conducted by people. And not all, not all management by humans was great, and some of it was, and it was disruption that was gentle disruption. It was and it had animal impact. So humans are animals too, right? We could all go out and and you know cut off brassicas at the base instead of removing them, and then put them into digester and put compost back out on the landscape, and walk around like we could try to mimic animals on landscapes. But I jest. Um, but yeah, I mean, humans are animals, and indigenous people did manage landscapes, really quite beautifully in most cases. Indigenous people also manage landscapes poorly. I mean, there are plenty of fragile landscapes that were destroyed by indigenous management, by human management. So these are all great experiments through time, and we just get to do the best we can, with what we got.
Probably a great place. It's noon.
Yeah, it's time to
It's
leave
noon.
before you
So
come after me with pitchforks.
I'm gonna put out a request. We've been getting some really lovely feedback, recognizing that part of our objective was to shake things up. We have to shake things up. But for those of you that were particularly inspired, we appreciate the information that's coming into the chat, but would you be willing to actually email us a testimonial? Because I think especially with this presentation where, again, all the classes are about converting turf into these sort of imagined gardens. And it's really, really important that we get this message out there as well, that the entire landscape can evolve. So if you were, I've asked some of you personally, we'd love a testimonial so that we can, inspire others to help us share this message as well. All right. That's a great place to start, and have a great day. It's raining. So
thank you, everybody, for all your contribution into this process. It's really beautiful. I'm reading all these wonderful I'm reading all these wonderful questions and comments, and you see how it works when people are considering it a dialogue instead of just a Q&A. I just think it's really wonderful. So please let people know about these, and have a great day. I'm going to make sure that no one from MWD or SoCal Gas wants to say anything more.
yes.
I'm like, oh, there we go.
Hey Pamela, hey Marianne. This is Joshua from SoCal Gas. Again, I'm just going to echo what they were saying to fill out the survey. Any feedback is appreciated. Also, I'll put in the chat if you guys want to look forward to any future landscape webinars. Also, we have sustainability events and techno seminars. I'm gonna put in the chat. Feel free to look on our website and check that out. And other than that, that was a great presentation, Marianne. Pamela, that was really great.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for supporting this and prompting us to, have meaningful dialogue around these things.
Of course, it's great.
Yeah, and I'll just really quickly echo what Joshua said. Thank you for a fantastic presentation, and thank you to all the participants for your lively engagement. As Pamela said, like when we can have that discord, that's where change happens. That's where we change our mindsets and can move forward. So thank you so much for your interest in this and participating.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone. Enjoy the rain if you have it. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.